Is there a set of guidelines for members of the board over impartiality during a general election to ensure that there's no interference, no attempt to? It just seems strange. If you remember, one of the accusations was that he went and berated members of the Newsnight team, during an election period.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the BBC has been forced to issue an extraordinary statement, admitting that it indeed indulged in deceitful coverage of the Amsterdam violence by Israeli hooligans last month. Yes, this is rare, but the UK's public broadcaster, funded by your hard-earned money called license fee, has admitted that it indeed indulged in fake news to project Israeli hooligans as victims. Let me recap what had happened. In early November, Israeli hooligans and supporters of the Maccabi Tel Aviv football club had gone on a rampage in Amsterdam after their team lost to Ajax football club in a Europa Cup match. This led to full-blown violence on the streets of Amsterdam. A Dutch photojournalist, Annet De Graaf, had captured the violent acts of Israeli hooligans and posted the video on social media. Many pro-Israeli media outlets, including the BBC, used her visuals and broadcast them with claims that people being thrashed in the video were Israeli fans, when in fact they were the rioters. The photojournalist protested and managed to get apologies from several international media outlets, including the New York Times. But it took the BBC nearly 2 months to issue a clarification. Still not an apology. In its statement, the BBC Newsnight said, and I quote, "During an interview on Newsnight with an Israeli fan about disorder after a football match between Maccabi Tel Aviv and Ajax in Amsterdam, we used stills and footage from the night to accompany the conversation. This included footage shot near the Amsterdam Central Station, appearing to show a large group chasing and attacking an individual. However, the author of the clip said separately on social media she had filmed Maccabi supporters attacking a Dutchman, and so its inclusion during this segment and some previous use when reporting reaction to the disorder on the BBC News channel could have given the impression that this was illustrating attacks on Israeli fans. We acknowledge that we should have been clearer about the context and that the use of the footage here was intended to illustrate the general disorder, and are happy to correct the record." End of quote. This is so cute. The BBC's sense of entitlement is such that they say that they are happy to correct themselves. They are happy to correct the record. They still don't feel that it should have been their duty to apologize long ago. Now, when the BBC carried video with fake claims, this was broadcast to Newsnight's 300,000 plus audience. But when it issued a clarification for its spectacular editorial lapses, it simply posted the admission of guilt on a nondescript page of its website, which you and I can hardly find out. So you would think the BBC is being truthful and honest here, but they are not. Why? Because there's still no on-air apology. Why have they not apologized? Why have they not repeated it from all his social media handles? That's because the intention is not pious. My sense is that the BBC Newsnight has been forced to issue this statement after the Dutch photojournalist may have threatened legal action against the British public broadcaster. But the Dutch photojournalist does not appear to be content with this statement from the BBC. In fact, she wrote on Twitter, and I quote, "The BBC will hear from me soon enough, BBC and the others." End of quote. Good on her. I think it's time that somebody teaches BBC a lesson. You cannot be allowed to go on, with your fake propaganda to shield Israel and its supporters from all kind of violent acts. This hasn't been an isolated incident, by the way, of brazen pro-Israel biases by BBC Newsnight during the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Remember this interview by Kirsty Walk with much respected Francesca Albanese more than a year ago? Francesca, whose job entails highlighting the breach of international laws in the occupied Palestinian territories, had appeared on Newsnight program immediately after the Israeli army has slaughtered more than 3,000 innocent Palestinians using the US and UK supplied weapons. But what was Kirsty Walk's question? She accused Francesca Albanese of advocating for Palestinian people. When Francesca shut her up by reminding that her job was not to advocate for anyone but to check if international laws were applied, which in this case were being violated by Israelis, Kirsty Walk decided to blame Hamas for the slaughter of thousands of Palestinians. This has been an established propaganda by Israelis and their friendly politicians and media personnel in the Western countries.
But as a rapporteur, you're advocating for the Palestinian people. Many Palestinians have absolutely nothing to do with Hamas.
Excuse me. I do not advocate for the Palestinian people. You are wrong. I advocate for the application of international law, human rights, and justice.
So in human rights and justice, do you think that Hamas cares that more than 3,000 children have died, more have been wounded, orphaned, and traumatized? When you're looking at international law, do you agree that Hamas is breaking law?
Excuse me, what question is it? I don't know if Hamas cares or not, but I know that it's Israel's responsibility not to bomb a 360 square kilometer strip of land where the people are besieged. Excuse me, I cannot be in an interview where I've just heard someone saying we are doing everything that we can to avoid civilian loss of life. This is not true because 8,000 people have already been killed. And if the Commissioner General of UNRWA says that 3,500 children, around 3,500 children have been killed, even if it's not fully verified, it means that it's likely, highly likely, because UNRWA has staff members who have been killed. There are journalists who have been killed. 50% of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed. The Palestinians in Gaza have nowhere to go. Please imagine what it is to have 2 million people, 200,000 living in 300 square meters, which is being bombed north to south. Where do these people have to go? There is no safe haven. These people are trapped and are being killed. This is what Israel is pursuing. Read their statement. They read the genocidal logic that is undergoing. And while we speak, there are people and Israeli human rights organizations are asking the world to look at what's happening in the West Bank.
But did the BBC ever admonish her or issue an apology? No. In any newsroom run by editorial ethics, such line of questioning by a presenter would warrant disciplinary action or even removal of presenter from on-air duty. That's because Walk had brought disrepute to the BBC with her pro-Israel biases. But the BBC bosses chose to look the other way. Would Kirsty Walk have asked similar questions and blamed the victims while interviewing a UN expert if the 3,000 odd victims were Ukrainians or non-Arabs or whites? It's been more than a year since that interview was broadcast on the BBC. And I'm still struggling to understand what kind of a human being you have to be to blame victims of genocide for their endless suffering. As I speak, the entire Gaza has been flattened by Israelis using American and British bombs. More than 200,000 innocent Palestinians have been murdered. Thousands of people in North Gaza are being forced to die of starvation because Israelis wouldn't let 8 trucks enter the area, and we have Kirsty Walk and people of her ilk in the Western media outlets blaming the victims of the genocide. Not a single word of condemnation for Israel. That's mind-boggling reality. As I said before, you cannot say that the presence of Robbie Gibb, the owner of the Jewish Chronicle in the BBC board, has nothing to do with these routine pro-Israel biases by BBC representatives. How can you allow the owner of Jewish Chronicle, which has been spewing venom against Palestinians all through this conflict, to remain in the highest decision-making body of the BBC? Do you have anyone representing the Palestinians in the board? No. Then how are you an unbiased news organization? Robbie Gibb is notorious for using his power to influence Newsnight editorials. I'm not saying that. This is what a prominent MP had told BBC Director General Tim Davie in a parliamentary committee hearing earlier this year. Watch it for yourself.
Thanks for that. And just can I say about being election ready and bias? Now, members of your board have been quite controversial in the past and accused of being partial, politically partial. Mr. Robbie Gibb springs to mind, just given another 4-year term on your board. Is there a set of guidelines for members of the board over impartiality during a general election to ensure that there's no interference, no attempt to? It just seems strange. If you remember, one of the accusations was that he went and berated members of the Newsnight team, during an election period. That wouldn't be appropriate, would it? So is there a set of guidelines there so that these people remain impartial?
Well, our guidelines apply to output. So what we're focused on is making sure that everything that we do...
Well, isn't he trying to influence output?
Well, first of all, he was invited to Newsnight, and I think berated is probably not quite...
We can argue about that.
There's not an argument, it's just true that he was invited. But the berated, I think, is a choice of word which perhaps not everybody would use. He had a discussion with them about the delivery of Newsnight, the delivery of impartiality. There is a code of conduct which applies to all non-executive directors of on the board.
Forgive me, but is that his role?
What is wrong?
To go down there and talk to them about delivering? Is that what he's on the board for?
No, but there isn't anything in the way in which the board is constructed as a unitary board which says that members of the board or non-executive directors of the board can't speak to programmes if programmes wish them to speak to them. There's nothing that says that. So it's not an offence against the governance of the BBC to do that. Of course, you then might judge what the conversation was about and so on and so forth. I wasn't there. But that's not in principle an offence against the governance of the BBC with a unitary board.
I'll go back to my original question, though. Is there some guidance for them during a period of a general election where it's being
there's a clear code of conduct. There is not specific guidelines for in answer directly to your question. We don't specifically say during an election because I think this is ongoing.
I have documented innumerable instances of BBC brazenly batting for Israel during this conflict. Remember how it reported the brutal murder of an autistic Palestinian boy by Israelis when they unleashed dogs on him and left his body to decompose for several days? These barbaric maniacs had not even allowed the autistic Palestinian boy's parents and other relatives to come to his rescue. But for the BBC, this was the best headline they had come up with. Then the brutal murder of a 6-year-old child, Hind Rajab, who Israelis had fired more than 300 rounds of US and UK supplied bullets at her. Once again, see how the BBC had reported this act of barbarism by Israelis. Thankfully, these headlines and pro-genocide actions by the BBC have been well documented. This will forever continue to haunt this once reputed news organization. There is absolutely no escaping from this reality. In fact, the pace with which the BBC is busy sacrificing its editorial ethics to defend Israel's genocidal campaign, there will come a time when even people like me will feel ashamed to associate themselves with this news organization. I'm glad that hundreds of thousands of people in the UK have already decided to cancel their license fees. Anyone who has an iota of humanity left in them will find it difficult to continue paying license fee if this is how the BBC uses their money. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you too think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.